I am putting this together, this small recording, just to demonstrate where I'm currently at with my research. I haven't been able to publish this due to a whole host of reasons, not least of all COVID-19 keeping everybody from traveling between countries. Excuse me. It's now 12:55 p.m. on the 25th of May, 2020. I started this research about 5 years ago, something to that effect, and I've come quite a long way. I feel that it's quite original, and I feel it's a fair contribution to human knowledge. In particular, something which I discovered was unique about the research today while discussing um, just the just the very basic description of um, core principles behind the thesis to Patricia Wood, who's a close friend and collaborator. And we were basically discussing a current project, which is called, well, I guess this is our critical path residency. We're collaborating basically from Cairns down to Sydney at this stage. And Trish is a choreographer. And we were trying to work out how to do this embodied score practice right from the get-go. And we came up with this idea of creating a planet, because the idea is that Trish needs somewhere to be able to collaborate, a space to collaborate in. So that was the essential kernel of the idea for this particular planet. And we call that planet Discordia. And in meditating on this concept, I decided to construct, I guess, just a real detailed outline of my own concepts that had emerged from the thesis itself. And we were discussing this morning for about 2 hours, since about 10 a.m. So I sat there and I explained to her this diagram without her seeing the diagram, which was really beneficial exercise to just really clear up in my own mind what I'm trying to say here. So the first thing I said is, this is a chart. So I have a figure here, and it's the storage of the concept, in inverted commas, green. And I've described it as an X world space expressed in mnemonic notation, containing sapiens S, represented by S, and artificial animal neural networks A at worldview points. And Trish was interested in this idea of worldview points, so I elaborated a bit more. So sapiens S and S2, they are at worldview points, and me, I'm M, I'm at a worldview point. And I said, so there are some different things in this graph. The first one is M, which is me, and then there's also some triangles nearby. They're S and S2, and they're also sapiens. They're also like me. They have a worldview point, sorry. And I said, and there's an A somewhere as well, which is like a sort of an animal. And then there's a big green thing, big green circle, and with an X in the middle of it. And this is the concept of X. And later in the conversation, after a lot of talk about terminology, we talked about how this is a slice of time. So you can imagine going forward, if this is X and Y, then going deeper into the 3D space behind this graph would be, you could move through the arrow of time using that, and you could just continuously take slices of this if you wanted to, and maybe graph how things have moved through this system. I also said this is a system of knowing. So knowledge is what's happening here. There's no such thing as belief. There's only knowing. And so we started talking about, I said, well, essentially this is sort of like a hierarchy of knowing. Oh, and I forgot to mention this L here. This is a law. It's a law. So like Trish said, oh, so like gravity. I said, yes, very much like gravity. It's a law. So instead of using the term hierarchy, right? This is what I said to Trish. I said, oh yeah, these things are in a hierarchy because they started a worldview point. She said, yeah, but not really. And I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. Why is she saying that? And what does she mean? And I inquired a bit, and Trish was pretty clear in communicating with me um, that these things were in relation to one another. And I said, oh, well, yeah, I know that, but this is coming from a programming perspective because a lot of this is inspired by game world design, and from that perspective, then you have these things called classes, and so this could very easily be represented in a programming language. And in fact, the way that I've drawn it up here using Miro, it is quite literally a programming language. These things are all classes in whatever it is that Miro has implemented in HTML for me to use this wonderful web um, space. So I said, well, okay, so you could have a class like person, and then you could have two different versions of that class. You could have Ben and Benedict and Patricia, and there'd be these two different types of person. One, what defines a person? Well, a person has a head and arms and legs and fingers and things. And then maybe Ben's fingers are different to Trisha's fingers. They have different qualities and attributes. So I said, so you kind of inherit the qualities from the class, the parent class. And so there's a hierarchy implicit in that. She said, well, sounds more like a classification system. I thought, oh, yeah, that makes sense. It's also a classification system. It's not necessarily a hierarchy. That's not the only way to look at it. And she said, well, and I said, even better could be it's a preference system. She didn't like that either. She said, no, well, it's not necessarily a preference, is it? And then I sort of interrupted her and said, well, what about knowingness? And so we sort of settled with that a little bit. It's not quite, we're not totally comfortable with that idea, but so yeah, the idea of knowingness. Okay, so we kept talking at length about where this idea comes from. And this is a big inspiration for my master's thesis. This is Plutchik's wheel of emotion, with basic emotions and derivative emotions, and it's got this cone-like formation up here. So this is the one that I settled with, and it's also known as Plutchik's flower sometimes, which is a nice metaphor. So I said to Trish, okay, so in order to explain this idea, I'll probably have to go back and talk about, or actually more of this middle idea that I haven't mentioned yet, the idea of mnemonics. I'm going to have to go back to this idea here, which I explored at length during my master's thesis. And I started off saying that I was talking to a good friend, Ben Goodger, many years ago, and he said to me, and to the people that were with us, would you like to hear how someone felt 500 years ago? And he played us a piece of lute music, a very beautiful piece of lute music, beautiful performance. And then afterwards I was talking to him and he said, I realized a long time ago, at some point anyway, that we experience everything through our emotions. And he sort of picked up a rock, experiences that through his emotions, a stick, a leaf, experiences all these things through his emotions. I thought, gee, that is really striking how you do experience everything through your emotions. And so I started explaining to Trish about my master's research. And I said there's a graph with little wheels of cheese in it, like those, really like the cool little Trivial Pursuit thing, whatever that is, with its little markers, game markers. I think you get, yeah, anyway, that doesn't matter. So here's one wheel of cheese at the top, and you just got to imagine, if you can't see the screen right now that I'm showing in the screen recording, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8 wheels of cheese, well, 8 slices in this wheel of cheese. And the top one at 12 o'clock says ecstasy. And then let's go around. So if there are 8 wheels, then let's go in lots of 1, 2, sort of that kind of thing. So if we go from ecstasy at 12 o'clock to 1, 2 o'clock is admiration, and then 3 o'clock is terror, and then 4, 5 o'clock is amazement, 6 o'clock is grief, and 7, 8 o'clock is loathing, 9 o'clock is rage, and 10 and 11 o'clock is vigilance. And then I said, so then there are these petals extending out from this wheel of cheese like figure. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 petals as well, all extending out from a little section of that wheel of cheese. So back to the top of the wheel of cheese, we had ecstasy there. That connects up with some petals, and it's segmented up into 3 bits. The next bit says joy, and then there's serenity, and then there's nothing at the very tip of the petal. And if I continue around, then the admiration petal is connected to the next 2 sections on that are trust and acceptance, and they all terminate at nothing at the top. And then you have terror with fear and apprehension as weaker versions of that. You can actually see when you're looking at the graph that the colors actually become more opaque as they move out to the edge. And then amazement, surprise, and distraction. Now we're up to 6 o'clock. Grief, sadness, pensiveness, loathing, disgust, boredom, rage, anger, annoyance, and vigilance, anticipation, and interest. And now we're back to ecstasy. And in between those petals in the empty sections, then in between serenity and acceptance, there's love. Acceptance and apprehension is submission. Apprehension and distraction has awe. Disapproval is in between distraction and our pensiveness at 6 o'clock. Remorse and boredom are the next 2. So we go pensiveness plus boredom equals remorse. Boredom plus annoyance equals contempt, and annoyance being the rage point there, which is around about 1:45 midnight there. And then between annoyance and interest is aggressiveness. And finally, in between interest and serenity, we have optimism. And so that's Plutchik's emotion circumflex, or Plutchik's wheel, or Plutchik's flower, excuse me. So I said, oh yeah, this is really cool, like this thing, and then Trish said, yeah, but, and eventually she came to the point, how does mindfulness come into this conversation? Because isn't emotional intelligence your ability to tell the difference between your emotional response and your emotional engagement? So I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And I guess the first time I came across mindfulness was in response to this idea, this rigid idea of emotion. This was very much in my mind, and I was reading Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, and I came up to a section in that where he talks about observing your thoughts as they pass. And Trish said, oh, yeah, like passing clouds. And you absorb those, you observe the thoughts. This is sort of an exercise. And you do this in a way to separate yourself from those thoughts, which can be troubling, or they could be a bit judgmental. And the idea is that by separating yourself from those thoughts, then you're no longer focusing on the future or the past. You're focusing on the present. So now being the most important thing, and really important as well, I think, just on the topic of emotion, is that the fundamental state in Tolle's book is that we're all happy at the very bottom of it all. And I'm sure that speaks volumes towards the Buddhist influences there. But anyway, without going into any of that, so I said, well, yeah, you're right. I agree with you. I think that this is a rigid way of doing things. I tried to create a system that dealt with this. It didn't work. I ended up, well, it didn't work. It did what it was designed to do. And I then, right at the same time as I was doing the work on this wheel, I was also working on some related work, and it ended up as my LP Distance. And Distance is all about that distance from your emotions, but it's also related to I was on some kind of medication at the time, which made me feel very separate from myself and my emotions. So it's also about dealing with that idea of being separate from yourself. So distance, and also distance is just a very interesting idea in general, just in terms of physics. In terms of music, the distance that something travels to get to your ears affects how it sounds, and there's spatial relationships that are happening, and I guess I'll get into them now. So I said, it's great because I was, with a friend in Freiburg, and I was talking to his partner, who's an art therapist, was his partner at the time, and she was saying that, well, I guess I spoke about this, I must have, and then she showed me something out of a textbook, which is a lovely, beautiful image where something like this has been used in therapy, and this is a tool for therapy. This isn't supposed to be like the be-all and end-all. Plutchik was a clinician, I think. Pretty sure that's where this comes from. But I won't go too much into that graph, as I said, but basically the patients of this particular art therapist who were in this textbook, they'd sort of done their own version of this where they filled up areas with all coloured paint and things like that, representing things. And so I like that because you get rid of the words, but you also get rid of the need to have X amount of things and, all these relationships where you're a bit too perfect and not very personal. And I ended up with this system as a response to that. And I said then to Trish, so with this system here, what you have is something which is based on the natural harmonic series in a sense, this little bit in the middle here, and I call it mnemonics, as mentioned. Now, mnemonics, what are they? Well, harmonics are something that you have in music. And I said, well, the reason I was interested in this because I was interested in how we perceive emotion in music, and I thought, well, maybe we can try and get right down to the core of that by looking at particular notes or chords. I think I ended up thinking chords were the way to do it. So there was some papers written about using dyads. So these dyads being 2-note chords, and these basically they had a bunch of respondents, and those respondents were given a list of words, and then they were just asked to basically say how much is this dyad in terms of these descriptors, emotional descriptors, and then you have to pick them. And so they got some interesting results, I guess. But in any case, so you have these descriptors, you have all these different emotional descriptors, and you have these supposedly neutral chords and this kind of thing. I thought, okay, so then maybe there's a relation to cadences, so having multiple of these chords in sequence, and I started looking through that, and this eventually ended me up going, no, wait. What's really missing here is the extra musical, so the stuff that's not able to be transmitted in a discretized way. And I guess if we're using musical scores or musical recordings, then what we essentially have is either some symbolic events, in the case of a score, or in the case of a recording, then we have fluctuations in amplitude over time. So we end up with something which is very much not symbolic information. It's very mimetic. It's really just if you had a needle, moving through those fluctuations in amplitude on a record, as they do when a record plays back, then the record's not particularly concerned with anything other than just the needle stays in the groove. That's it. That's all that happens, and then you end up with the impression of music. So that's not really the place to go. I think it's interesting because there's been all these studies and stuff right into how the ear works and psychoacoustics, and this is all really important. I'll get to that in a second, but these in-depth studies into psychoacoustics, they are trying to go sort of the wrong way around, in my opinion, of saying like, okay, here's the sound, this is the starting point. We need to start with this sound that we have, and we need to then extract all the features from it. And the problem with that approach is that actually a lot of the features are represented out in whatever world space that they exist in, and there are stakeholders, I guess you could call them, in identifying what one of these musical features is. So there are quite a lot of musical features which can only be tracked in real time because of the fact that there's all these stakeholders in the relationships that make up what music is. Music's always evolving. This doesn't mean that it can't be absolutely meticulously documented. I don't think that you could really do it in its entirety, but there's a possibility that this system could be used for that. Anyway, I digress. So back to what I was saying to Trish. And Trish had said, emotional intelligence is the ability to tell the difference between your emotional response and your emotional engagement. I said, oh yeah, I was trying to get beyond words, and she was looking for words because that's what we have. And I was explaining at length, I guess, what got me to this point between these two graphs. And I just said it in this fashion, that if you press the A key on the piano, then a little hammer strikes a string, is felt on the end of the hammer. The string's then set into vibration. Those little vibrations excite air packets, pockets of air molecules around the string. They move in waves out towards the listener. The listener's ear then encounters those waves, and then they're translated in all sorts of different ways until they end up as kind of like, just think of them as electricity, I guess, or maybe even better, like maybe the air is kind of exciting some hairs in the ear. So there's a little thing inside the cochlea called the basilar membrane. There's a bunch of little hairs on that. When the sound sort of excites those hairs, and it's quite literally like the piano, those hairs. There's one hair down the bottom, big hair, which is kind of and further spaced apart from the other hairs, which is sort of like that string on the piano that you press, and then right at the top, there's kind of like more the strings on the top of the piano kind of thing. So it's almost like you're sort of playing those ear hairs when you press the A key. And if those hairs kind of buzz around and bump into each other and stuff, they call it tickling. I like to call it tickling at a distance. I'm sure it's been called that. I can't remember if I got that from somewhere. But tickling at a distance. So there's like something going on there, and you can kind of feel this sensation in your ear now. But what happens? And of course, that's all stuff that's been worked out, which is awesome. It's amazing stuff worked out in the past, especially from initially with Helmholtz. Hermann von Helmholtz and his treatise on the, can't remember, it's like really long title, but in any case, it's like on the sensations of tone or something. And he worked out roughness, which is sort of what I just described then, but a lot more detail. And there's a mathematical formula for how you can calculate roughness and so on and so forth. And when those little hairs, they bounce and they sort of vibrate, it's sort of like there's a little mini piano in your ear and it's vibrating away, and it's happening very, very fast. And then those signals travel up into your auditory cortex, and what that does is it gives you, now this is where I bring in the concept of a harmonic. So even though we press the A on the piano, there's also other notes present. So if you've ever seen somebody playing a guitar, then sometimes they might sort of lightly press the string somewhere, usually in the middle of the string or sort of like up the top. But basically, anyway, they divide the string up in half or into 4 pieces or whatever it happens to be, and press it really lightly at that point, and then they pluck it. And what it basically does is it mutes the A that we're talking about, and you end up getting a much higher, much like nice, no, like a nice perfect tone, very open, glassy tone, but it's not as bassy. It doesn't have the bass to it, and that's how harmonics work. So if you were to have the bass there, you just wouldn't hear the other one, but they're both sounding. You can hear them both at the same time, and there's loads and loads and loads of these harmonics that get sent up by the note, thousands. So an A is actually made up of like thousands of notes. It's just that the bottom one is the one you hear because it's the loudest. It's the best way to think of that. And that's how our ear works too. So we get these notes coming into our brain piano, and if I press the A on the piano, then the way that the brain knows that it's a piano and not a guitar is because of those harmonics. So those harmonics contain all that information, and our brain goes, oh, that's a guitar, I remember a guitar. And this is the point at which I realized what the most significant and most valuable contribution that this research makes to human understanding. And it is that this portal between these two worlds of the physical, the describable, the world of physics and all those subsets of it, can now be translated through all the way through in this tiny, tiny systematic little way, all the way through the brain where ideas emerge. So that means that there's a portal there between metaphor, right, so literal ideas, and what's happening in the physical world. There's a portal there. Our brain is going, I heard these harmonics, therefore I know that a guitar played that. And when I just got out of the shower then, just before I started to record this, I thought, you know what? That's really, really important, because that portal, which lets us move from the physical describable universe into the mind via that system of metaphor, that will allow us to communicate these much more sophisticated and fundamental ideas, and I've been thinking about them as art or music, but it's far wider reaching that. And memetics is definitely the closest related field to what I'm discovering here, and that's how it came about. But there is a literal connection there that can be used. So in a very, very real way, it is possible to play music or art where we are conscious of what we're referencing in a literal sense. And I guess that's pretty obvious, because if I wanted to make a piece of music which used like a guitar and a violin, and I tried to illustrate this concept using that by chopping and changing and switching up, then playing notes and things like that, or say I wanted to say, oh, this chord means this word and that kind of thing. The problem with doing that, and this is what people have tried to do again and again and again, is if you're using words and linguistics as the underlying system through which you try to communicate through music, you're completely throwing out the baby with the bathwater. You're missing the point of what music is and how music can be used to communicate at a metaphorical level without words, which is quite incredible if you think about it. So there is a possibility using this theory to go beneath the words to access something which is not in that Plutchik's flower type sense. I mean, this example is just about emotion. It's psychoevolutionary nature of emotion. So this is an attempt to kind of try and look at the same thing, but in maybe a much simpler way in some senses. But yeah, so if I say, okay, this is sort of a mirror image of the other system that I just talked about, the harmonic system. So you have your harmonics that make up a tone. And then what does that happen? Okay, so harmonics, they're all there, they make up a tone. We've got our A on the piano, goes through here, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's an A on a piano. Okay, how do I work out that it's an A on a piano? So here's me at my worldview perspective, and I've been using the term green here. I'm going to replace this now with the idea of an A on the piano. Let's call it that. So X is representative of our idea of what an A being played on the piano is, and so I access with my mind, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, the fact that I know that this particular,